December 7th, 1941. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, their decks still warm from launching the most successful naval airstrike in history, turned northwest toward home waters. In the briefing rooms below, pilots celebrated. They had sunk or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, killed more than 2,000 Americans. The cost, 29 Japanese aircraft, fewer than 60 men. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did not celebrate. He had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington, traveled across America by car. He had seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the automobile factories of Detroit, the shipyards stretching along both coasts. When his staff toasted the victory, Yamamoto's words were quiet. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His staff dismissed this as excessive caution. Japan now controlled the Pacific. The American battleship fleet lay broken in the mud of Pearl Harbor. The Philippines would fall within months. The Dutch East Indies, with their oil fields, were nearly in hand. Most importantly, America had only 3 carriers left in the Pacific: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. Japan had 10. The mathematics seemed clear. But Yamamoto understood something his younger officers did not. America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's. Before the war, American steel production was approximately 12 times larger than Japan's. American shipyards could build vessels Japan couldn't imagine constructing. The question was never whether America could replace its losses. The question was whether Japan could win before America's industrial machine reached full production. 6 months later, the mathematics began to shift. June 4th, 1942. Midway Atoll. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, burned. Flames consumed the hangars where aircraft had been refueling and rearming when American dive bombers appeared overhead. By sunset, all 4 had sunk. Japan's margin of carrier superiority vanished in a single afternoon. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff absorbed the loss. 4 carriers gone, but they still had 6. Shokaku, Zuikaku, Gunyo, Hiyo, Ryujo, Zuiho. America had 3, possibly 4 if Yorktown survived, which it hadn't. Japan's shipyards were already constructing new carriers. The war of attrition could still be won. What they didn't know was that in Newport, News, Virginia, in Quincy, Massachusetts, in Brooklyn, New York, in Norfolk, Philadelphia, and Camden, American shipyards had already laid the keels for a new class of carrier. Not 1 or 2, 24, and these would be larger, faster, and more capable than anything Japan had ever built. The Essex-Class carriers. The design had been finalized before Pearl Harbor, but construction accelerated dramatically after Midway. The lead ship, USS Essex, had her keel laid on April 28, 1941. By December, when war came, her hull was already taking shape. After Midway, the work intensified. Shifts ran round the clock. Welders worked by floodlight. The sound of riveting never stopped. In Japan, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal was building Taiho, Japan's newest fleet carrier. She would be the most advanced carrier Japan ever produced. Armored flight deck, enclosed bow, improved damage control. She represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval architecture. Her keel had been laid in July 1941. She would take 3 years to complete. Essex took 20 months, April 31st, 1943. USS Essex commissioned at Newport News. 33,000 tons, 90 aircraft, 33 knots. Her flight deck stretched 872 feet. Her crew numbered 2,600 men. She was larger than any Japanese carrier, except the converted battleship Shinano, which wouldn't launch for another year. In Tokyo, naval intelligence noted the commissioning. 1 new American carrier, concerning but not catastrophic. Japan's carriers were still operating effectively in the Solomons. Shokaku and Zuikaku remained formidable. The new Taiho would join the fleet soon. The war of attrition continued. Then the reports started coming faster. August 17, 1943. USS Yorktown commissioned. The second Essex-Class, named for the carrier lost at Midway. Same specifications as Essex, same capabilities. November 24th, USS Lexington commissioned. The third Essex-Class, named for the carrier lost in the Coral Sea. December 15th, USS Bunker Hill commissioned. December 31st, USS Wasp and USS Cowpens commissioned on the same day. 6 Essex-Class carriers operational by the end of 1943. And the intelligence reports showed more under construction. Many more. In the Navy Ministry building in Tokyo, officers studied the reports with growing unease. America was commissioning fleet carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. The implications were staggering. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a naval aviator who served on the staff of the Third Fleet, later wrote about this period. The arrival of the Essex-Class carriers, he said, marked the moment when Japan's naval strategists realized they were fighting an opponent who operated under completely different rules. Japan built ships carefully, slowly, with craftsmanship. America built them the way they built automobiles, on assembly lines, with interchangeable parts, at a pace that seemed impossible. The Essex-Class carriers weren't just numerous, they were good. Their design incorporated lessons from the first years of war, improved damage control systems, better anti-aircraft armament, larger aviation fuel capacity, deck edge elevators that allowed faster aircraft operations. They were, in many ways, superior to Japan's newest carriers, and America was building them faster than Japan could sink them. February 17, 1944, USS Hornet commissioned. 7th Essex-Class. March 20, USS Franklin commissioned. 8th, April 24, USS Ticonderoga commissioned. 9th, May 15, USS Randolph commissioned. 10th. The pace was accelerating, roughly 1 carrier per month. Japan's entire pre-war carrier force had numbered 10 carriers total, accumulated over 2 decades. America was matching that number in less than a year, with carriers that were larger and more capable. Admiral Somu Toyoda, who would become Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet in May 1944, later described the strategic situation. Japan, he said, had entered the war knowing it couldn't match American industrial production. The plan had been to seize the resource areas of Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter, and make the cost of breaking that perimeter so high that America would negotiate peace. But that strategy required time. It required America to grow weary before its industrial advantage became overwhelming. The Essex-Class carriers meant time had run out. By June 1944, the strategic reality was undeniable. Japan had lost most of its experienced carrier pilots in the Solomons campaign. The replacement pilots had far less training. Instead of the 2 years of instruction pre-war, pilots received, new pilots got perhaps 6 months. Fuel shortages meant limited flight time. The quality gap was enormous, and now they would face not 3 or 4 American carriers, but a fleet that outnumbered them by factors they couldn't counter. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Mobile Fleet, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, sailed to contest the American invasion of Saipan. Ozawa had 9 carriers. The fleet carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, plus 6 light carriers, approximately 450 aircraft. The American Fifth Fleet had 15 carriers. 7 were Essex-Class, Hornet, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Essex, Lexington, Enterprise. 8 were light carriers. Together they carried approximately 900 aircraft. The numbers were worse than they appeared. The American pilots were experienced, well-trained, flying superior aircraft. The Japanese pilots were largely inexperienced, many on their first combat mission. The American carriers had radar, fighter direction officers, coordinated defense. The Japanese relied on visual sighting and individual initiative. The battle began at dawn. Japanese aircraft launched in 4 waves. American radar picked them up 70 miles out. F-6F Hellcat fighters, directed by radar controllers, intercepted them far from the carriers. What followed was later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston, flying from Lexington, later described it. The Japanese formations came in steady and straight, as if on a training exercise. They didn't take evasive action. They didn't break formation when attacked. They simply flew forward while American fighters tore through them. It was, Winston said, almost too easy. And that's when you realized how much had changed since 1942. By day's end, Japan had lost approximately 330 aircraft. The carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced, took a single torpedo hit. Poor damage control allowed aviation fuel vapors to spread through the ship. Hours later, a spark ignited them. The explosion tore Taiho apart. She sank with nearly 1,600 men. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, took multiple torpedo hits. She sank that afternoon. American losses, approximately 120 aircraft, most to operational causes rather than combat. Not a single ship damaged. The Battle of the Philippine Sea broke Japan's carrier aviation. The loss of 300 pilots couldn't be replaced. The loss of 2 fleet carriers couldn't be replaced. But more fundamentally, the battle demonstrated that Japan was now fighting a carrier force it had no hope of defeating. 7 Essex-Class carriers had participated, and intelligence reports showed more entering service every month. In the weeks after the battle, Japanese naval leadership faced the mathematics. They had 6 carriers left. 3 were light carriers with limited aircraft capacity. The Americans had more than 20 carriers now, with more commissioning monthly. The pilot quality gap was enormous and widening. The industrial capacity gap was absolute. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who would later organize the first kamikaze units, put it bluntly in a staff meeting. "We cannot win a conventional naval war," he said. "We don't have the ships, we don't have the pilots, we don't have the fuel. Every month America adds carriers faster than we can sink them. The mathematics are impossible." Someone asked how many carriers America could eventually build. Onishi had seen the intelligence estimates. "As many as they want," he said. This was not exaggeration. By war's end, America would commission 17 Essex-Class carriers, with 7 more completed too late to see combat. Additionally, America built more than 100 escort carriers, smaller vessels for convoy protection and amphibious support. Japan's total carrier production during the entire war: 6 fleet carriers, several light carriers, and a handful of escort conversions. The disparity wasn't just in numbers, it was in the entire industrial system supporting those ships. Each Essex-Class carrier required approximately 47 million man-hours to build. America had the shipyard capacity, the steel production, the trained workers, the electrical systems, the radar equipment, the aircraft, the fuel, the ordnance, and the logistical support to build and operate 24 of them simultaneously. Japan struggled to complete one. Admiral Toyoda later reflected on this period. The arrival of the Essex-Class carriers, he said, represented the materialization of Yamamoto's pre-war fears. America had awakened. Its industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, was overwhelming. "We had counted on American unwillingness to pay the cost of war," Toyoda said, "but they weren't unwilling, and the cost to them, in industrial terms, was negligible. They built carriers the way we built trucks." The comparison was apt. In 1944, American shipyards launched approximately 1 major warship every 3 days. This included battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Japan's entire shipbuilding industry couldn't match the output of American carrier production alone. October 24 through 25, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japan's last major naval operation. The plan was desperate. Use the remaining carriers as bait to draw American carriers north, while battleships and cruisers attacked the invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf. The carrier force, under Admiral Ozawa, had 4 carriers, Saikaku, the last survivor of Pearl Harbor, plus 3 light carriers. Together they carried approximately 116 aircraft, barely more than a single American fleet carrier. Many were trainers or obsolete types. Pilot quality was abysmal. The American Third Fleet, under Admiral William Halsey, had 8 fleet carriers. 6 were Essex-Class: Intrepid, Hancock, Hornet, Franklin, Lexington, Essex. They carried approximately 700 aircraft. Ozawa's mission was to be sunk. His carriers existed to die, drawing American carriers away from Leyte Gulf. It was the final admission that Japan's carrier force no longer had any other purpose. The battle proceeded as planned. American aircraft found Ozawa's carriers on October 25th. Wave after wave of strikes hit the Japanese ships. Zuikaku, which had attacked Pearl Harbor, which had fought at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz and Philippine Sea, took multiple bomb and torpedo hits. She capsized and sank in the afternoon. The 3 light carriers followed her down. Japan's carrier force ceased to exist. The last of the Pearl Harbor carriers was gone. The mobile fleet, which had once dominated the Pacific, was finished. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff knew the war was lost. The loss of the carriers themselves barely mattered. They had no pilots, no aircraft, no fuel to operate them anyway. What mattered was what those losses represented. America's industrial capacity had produced a carrier fleet Japan couldn't challenge, couldn't match, couldn't even significantly damage. The Essex-Class carriers continued entering service. USS Bonhomme Richard commissioned in November 1944. USS Leyte in April 1945. USS Philippine Sea in May. They arrived to find no Japanese carriers left to fight. Commander Okumiya, in his post-war writings, described the psychological impact of the Essex-Class production. Japanese naval officers had studied American industrial capacity before the war. They had seen the statistics, but statistics were abstract. The Essex-Class carriers made it concrete. Every month, Okumiya wrote, another one appeared. Then another. Then another. It was like fighting an opponent who could replace every loss instantly while you bled to death from wounds you couldn't heal. The kamikaze attacks that began in October 1944 were, in part, a response to this industrial reality. Conventional attacks couldn't sink carriers faster than America built them. Suicide attacks, using the aircraft and pilots as the weapon itself, offered the only mathematical possibility of inflicting unsustainable losses. It was an admission that Japan had lost the industrial war completely. Even this failed. The Essex-Class carriers proved remarkably difficult to sink. Their improved damage control, compartmentalization, and structural strength allowed them to absorb multiple kamikaze hits and remain operational. USS Franklin took 2 bomb hits that killed more than 700 men and sparked massive fires. She survived. USS Bunker Hill took 2 kamikaze hits that killed nearly 400 men. She survived. USS Intrepid was hit by kamikazes 5 separate times. She survived. Of the 17 Essex-Class carriers that saw combat, none were sunk. Several were heavily damaged. All returned to service. After the war, American occupation forces interviewed Japanese naval officers extensively. The interrogations were conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, seeking to understand Japanese strategic decision-making. The interviews returned repeatedly to the same theme: the impossibility of competing with American industrial production. Admiral Toyoda, in his interrogation, was asked when he realized Japan couldn't win the war. His answer was precise. When the intelligence reports showed the rate of American carrier construction, he said. We had known America's industrial capacity was larger than ours, but seeing it manifest in the form of fleet carriers appearing monthly made the situation undeniable. We couldn't build them that fast. We couldn't train pilots that fast. We couldn't produce aircraft that fast. We couldn't do anything at the speed America could. Asked why Japan continued fighting after this became clear, Toyoda paused. Because, he said finally, surrender was unthinkable, and because we hoped, irrationally perhaps, that America's will might break before our capacity did. It was never a sound strategic calculation, but it was all we had. The Essex-Class carriers represented something beyond mere naval power. They represented the industrial gulf that made the Pacific War's outcome inevitable once America's economy fully mobilized. Japan had started the war, knowing it couldn't match American production. The strategic gamble was that it wouldn't have to, that a defensive perimeter and high costs would lead to negotiated peace before American industry reached full output. The Essex-Class carriers proved that gamble wrong. They arrived too fast, in too great numbers, with too much capability. They made the war of attrition unwinnable. They transformed the Pacific from a contested ocean into an American lake. By war's end, America had commissioned 17 Essex-Class carriers for combat service. 7 more were completed after the war ended. The class would serve for decades, with several seeing combat in Korea and Vietnam. They were, in many ways, the most successful carrier class ever built, not just because of their capabilities, but because of what their production represented. In the Navy Ministry building in Tokyo, in the months after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, staff officers sometimes stood at the windows overlooking the city. They knew American bombers would eventually come. They knew the war was lost. They knew it had been lost, in industrial terms, before it began. One officer, whose name wasn't recorded, supposedly said to a colleague, "Yamamoto tried to warn us. He told us we'd awaken a giant. We didn't believe the giant was really that large. And then we saw the carriers, one after another, and we understood." The colleague asked what they understood. That we'd started a war, the officer said, with a nation that could build warships faster than we could count them. The Essex-Class carriers weren't just ships. They were the visible manifestation of American industrial might, appearing in the Pacific like a tide that couldn't be stopped, couldn't be matched, couldn't be survived. They were the answer to every Japanese strategic calculation, arriving one after another, until the ocean itself seemed to belong to them. And in the end, it did.